Beneath the floorboards of an abandoned church in the dense forests of upstate New York, 143 unmarked graves were discovered in 1862. Each skeleton, as documented by local authorities, showed signs of systematic torture, fractured limbs that had healed before death, evidence of repeated near-drowning, and strange markings carved into their bones. For over 160 years, federal records concerning the Church of the Pure Spirit remained sealed, accessible only to those with special clearance. Documents I've obtained, never before revealed to the public, detail how three brothers, known as Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, convinced hundreds of devoted followers that suffering was the sole path to salvation. These papers reveal how their dark rituals of purification led to what may be the most disturbing religious cult in American history. During the early 19th century, the small settlement of Ravenwood in upstate New York was unremarkable in most ways. Nestled approximately 40 miles north of Albany between rolling hills and dense forests, it consisted of perhaps 300 souls who made their living through farming, timber, and trade with neighboring communities. Founded in 1803 by settlers moving north from the Hudson Valley in search of fertile land and new opportunities, Ravenwood found itself, like much of upstate New York during this period, at the epicenter of what historians would later call the Second Great Awakening. This was a time of intense religious revival that swept across America in the early 1800s. The region became known as the Burned-Over District due to the fervor of religious movements that seemed to ignite and spread like wildfire across its communities. It was an era when new denominations were born, old faiths were questioned, and charismatic preachers could draw crowds numbering in the thousands to outdoor revival meetings. Into this spiritual tumult arrived the Ravencroft Brothers in the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, the eldest at 42, had the commanding presence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His deep-set eyes, nearly black in certain light, seemed to peer into one's very soul when he spoke of divine matters. Deacon Silas, 39, was more scholarly in appearance with wire-rimmed spectacles and slender fingers perpetually stained with ink from his continuous writing of religious texts. Prophet Caleb, the youngest at 35, possessed an unsettling quality that many found both attractive and disturbing. He spoke in whispers that somehow carried across crowded rooms, and his pale blue eyes would often roll back during what he claimed were divine visions. The brothers arrived with substantial means, purchasing a large tract of land on the outskirts of town where they immediately began construction of what they called the Church of the Pure Spirit. Unlike the simple white clapboard meeting houses common throughout New England and New York, their church was built of dark stone quarried from the nearby hills. Its architecture was unusual, a central octagonal sanctuary surrounded by 8 smaller chambers with a steeple rising to a height that seemed excessive for such a remote location. Most striking was the absence of windows in the main sanctuary, with light provided only by carefully positioned lanterns during services. "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," Elder Ezra announced at their first gathering, which curiosity had made well attended despite initial skepticism from locals. "In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation. The Spirit has revealed to us that this community shall be the cradle of a new understanding." The brothers had timed their arrival perfectly. The religious landscape of 1825 America was fractured and uncertain. Traditional denominations like the Episcopalians and Presbyterians were losing ground to more emotional and demonstrative faiths. Methodists were gaining converts through circuit riders who brought fiery sermons to the frontier. Baptists were expanding rapidly with their emphasis on individual conversion experiences. And new American-born faiths were emerging. The Mormons would begin their journey just 1 year later and less than 100 miles away when Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830. In this environment of spiritual searching, the Ravencrofts' message found fertile ground. Their doctrine was deceptively simple at first: true salvation could only be achieved through suffering that burned away sin and impurity. They cited biblical passages about refinement through fire and Christ's suffering on the cross. But what distinguished their teaching was the literal interpretation. Physical suffering was not just metaphorical but necessary for spiritual cleansing. "The flesh is the vessel of sin," Deacon Silas would explain during early sermons, his voice measured and reasonable. "Therefore, the flesh must be tested, tried, and purified through tribulation. Only when the body has been broken can the spirit truly soar." Their congregation grew steadily through that first year. The brothers were selective about who could join, requiring potential members to undergo a discernment interview with Prophet Caleb, who would determine if they were worthy vessels for purification. Those accepted were predominantly from 3 groups: the desperately poor seeking community and purpose, the deeply troubled seeking redemption from past sins, and the wealthy seeking spiritual experiences beyond what traditional churches offered. Margaret Wilkins was among the first converts, a widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever the previous winter. She had been contemplating ending her life when she encountered Elder Ezra in town. He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts, she wrote in a journal later discovered by federal investigators. He told me my suffering had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair. By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown to nearly 100 members. Some lived in simple dwellings constructed around the church, while others maintained homes in Ravenwood but spent most of their time at the church compound. The Ravencrofts encouraged members to donate their property and savings to the church, explaining that worldly attachments prevented spiritual elevation. The most devoted followers were invited to become vessels of the Spirit, a special status that required them to undergo more intensive purification rituals. These early ceremonies were relatively mild compared to what would come later: extended fasting, night-long prayer vigils, and rituals involving ice-cold water that symbolized the drowning of the sinful self. What few outsiders realized was how methodically the Ravencrofts were escalating the intensity of these practices. Like the proverbial frog in slowly heating water, their followers were being conditioned to accept increasingly extreme forms of purification without recognizing the dangerous path they were traveling. By 1829, when construction began on an extensive network of chambers beneath the church, the Ravencrofts had established complete control over their followers' lives, thoughts, and bodies. The stage was set for darkness to descend upon the Church of the Pure Spirit. As Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers in a private meeting documented years later, the sheep have been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd. The people of Ravenwood would soon discover that the Ravencroft Brothers' definition of shepherd had little to do with protection and everything to do with sacrifice. The transformation of the Church of the Pure Spirit from an unusual but seemingly benign religious community to something far more sinister can be traced to a specific date: December 21, 1829, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. What occurred that night would later be referred to in secret church documents as the First Ascension and would establish the pattern for the horrors that followed. The day began with an announcement from Elder Ezra that Prophet Caleb had received a profound vision during the night. The entire congregation was summoned to the church for what was described as a revelation of the next level of purification. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped below freezing, nearly 150 followers filled the windowless sanctuary, which was illuminated only by 12 large candles positioned at the points of an enormous pattern carved into the wooden floor, a spiral that wound inward toward a central platform. Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith who had joined the church 6 months earlier following the death of his wife, later escaped and provided testimony about what happened next. According to Hartford, Elder Ezra addressed the congregation with unusual intensity, his voice rising to a fever pitch as he described how their previous purification rituals had been merely preparation for the true cleansing. "Brothers and sisters," Elder Ezra proclaimed, "we have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently toward understanding. But the Spirit grows impatient with our progress. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation, and it requires greater courage than we have yet demanded." At this point, Prophet Caleb emerged from one of the side chambers. Witnesses described him as appearing transformed, his skin unnaturally pale, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes rolled back to show only whites. He began to speak in what he claimed was the tongue of angels, a series of guttural sounds and high-pitched wails that echoed through the sanctuary. After several minutes of this disturbing display, Prophet Caleb collapsed to the floor. When he rose again, he spoke in his normal voice, but with a cadence and authority that many found mesmerizing. He announced that the Spirit had selected 3 members of the congregation for the honor of First Ascension. Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters, he called out. "The Spirit has found you worthy of elevation." The 3 individuals, all relatively recent converts to the church, were led to the central platform by Deacon Silas. What followed was described by Hartford as a ceremony unlike anything I believed possible among civilized people. Each of the 3 was stripped to their undergarments despite the winter cold. They were then bound to wooden frames that had been constructed in the shape of inverted crosses. Elder Ezra explained to the congregation that inverting the sacred symbol was not blasphemy but rather represented the necessary reversal of fortune, from pride to humility, from comfort to suffering, from life to death to rebirth. For the next several hours, the Ravencroft brothers subjected the 3 chosen ones to a series of torments they called the 7 trials of purification. First came the trial of air, in which wet cloths were placed over their faces while water was slowly poured over them, creating the sensation of drowning. Then came the trial of earth, where soil from the church grounds was packed around their bodies up to their necks, effectively burying them alive for short periods. The trial of fire involved heated metal implements pressed briefly against their skin, leaving burn marks in specific patterns. The trial of water saw them repeatedly submerged in ice-cold water until they lost consciousness, then revived. Hartford's testimony becomes fragmented when describing the final 3 trials, as he admitted to having vomited and nearly fainted during the proceedings. What is clear from multiple accounts is that throughout these tortures, the 3 victims were encouraged to embrace their suffering as divine blessing. Whenever they screamed in pain, the congregation was instructed to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." Most disturbing was the congregation's response. Hartford reported that while some members wept quietly or looked away, many appeared entranced, watching with expressions of reverence or ecstasy. The Ravencrofts had spent years conditioning their followers to associate pain with spiritual advancement. And now that conditioning bore its terrible fruit. Near dawn, when the 7 trials were complete, the 3 victims hung limp on their frames, barely conscious but still alive. Elder Ezra announced that they had been emptied of sin and were now ready to be filled with the pure Spirit. What happened next would haunt those who witnessed it for the remainder of their lives. Prophet Caleb approached each victim and placed his hands on their heads, whispering into their ears. According to Hartford and one other witness who later spoke to authorities, the 3 victims suddenly convulsed violently, their bodies arching against their restraints with such force that bones could be heard breaking. Their eyes flew open, bulging and bloodshot, and they began speaking in the same strange language Prophet Caleb had demonstrated earlier. By sunrise, all 3 had died. Elder Ezra proclaimed them successfully ascended and declared that their souls had been so thoroughly purified that they had been accepted directly into heaven, bypassing judgment. Their bodies, he explained, were merely empty vessels now to be revered as holy relics. The 3 corpses were not buried immediately. Instead, they were placed in one of the newly constructed chambers beneath the church, laid out on stone slabs where congregation members could view them and pray for similar elevation. According to church records later seized by authorities, these were the first of what would eventually become hundreds of bodies stored in the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. The morning after the first ascension, several congregation members quietly packed their belongings and fled Ravenwood. Thomas Hartford was among them, though he would not speak of what he had witnessed for many years, believing no one would believe such horrors possible in Christian America. Those who remained became even more devoted to the Ravencrofts and their twisted doctrine. The brothers had crossed a threshold into murder disguised as religious ceremony and found that their control over their followers was not diminished but strengthened. Within the Church of the Pure Spirit, death had become sacrament. As Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers after the ceremony in a conversation later recounted by a church elder who eventually turned state's evidence, "Now we have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now." He was right. The first ascension marked only the beginning of the atrocities at the Church of the Pure Spirit. What followed would be 3 decades of escalating horror hidden behind the respectable facade of religious devotion. In the years following the first ascension, the Church of the Pure Spirit underwent a transformation that went largely unnoticed by the outside world. From 1830 to 1845, the Ravencroft brothers refined their methods and expanded their influence, developing both their theological justifications and their practical techniques for what they termed elevations, but what were in reality ritualized killings. The brothers were careful to maintain a veneer of respectability. The public face of their church emphasized charity, community, and spiritual renewal, themes that resonated perfectly with the ongoing religious revival sweeping through the burned-over district. Outwardly, they participated in the broader religious community, occasionally hosting gatherings where other preachers were invited to speak and making donations to causes such as temperance societies and orphanages. Behind this facade, however, the true nature of their operations grew increasingly complex and disturbing. The underground chambers, initially constructed as simple cellars, were expanded into an elaborate network of tunnels and rooms that extended far beyond the church's footprint. Local workers hired for the initial construction were replaced by devoted church members who could be trusted with secrets, and eventually the excavation was performed exclusively by vessels of the Spirit, followers who had proven their absolute loyalty. By 1835, the catacombs, as they came to be known among the inner circle, contained at least 7 large chambers and dozens of smaller alcoves. Each served a specific function in the Ravencrofts' twisted theology: the chamber of preparation where candidates for elevation were kept in isolation for days before their ordeal, the chamber of trials where the 7 purification tortures were administered, the chamber of ascension where the final fatal rituals took place, and most disturbing of all, the chamber of saints where the bodies of the ascended were preserved. This preservation of corpses became a central element of the cult's practices. Unlike most religious groups that reverently bury their dead, the Ravencrofts kept the bodies of their victims in various states of preservation. Some were partially mummified using techniques Deacon Silas had allegedly learned from medical texts. Others were reduced to clean skeletons through methods that investigators would later struggle to reconstruct. These remains were arranged in elaborate tableaus throughout the chamber of saints, posed in positions of prayer or ecstasy, sometimes articulated with wire to maintain their posture. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832 and eventually escaped in 1844, provided some of the most detailed accounts of these chambers. "The smell was the first thing that struck you," she recounted to federal investigators. "Not the stench of decay, as one might expect, but the overwhelming odor of chemicals, turpentine, alcohol, and something sweeter I couldn't identify." The brothers claimed it was the perfume of sanctity, but I later learned it was substances used in embalming. Carver described how new members were gradually introduced to the existence of these chambers, first hearing about them as symbolic spaces, then being permitted limited access to the less disturbing areas, and finally, for those deemed most loyal, being allowed to witness or even participate in the rituals conducted within them. "It was a careful seduction," she explained. "By the time you saw the Chamber of Saints with its dozens of corpses arranged like some grotesque congregation, you had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that it seemed beautiful rather than horrifying. I remember weeping with what I thought was religious ecstasy the first time I was permitted entry. Now those tears shame me beyond words." The frequency of elevations increased gradually over the years. In 1830, according to church records later seized as evidence, there were only 2 such ceremonies, resulting in 5 deaths. By 1835, the number had risen to quarterly events, each claiming 2 to 4 lives. And by 1840, monthly elevations had become the norm, with special ceremonies on solstices and equinoxes often taking larger numbers of victims. The Ravencrofts became selective in choosing candidates for elevation. Initially, they favored those without close family connections, widows, orphans, and drifters who would not be missed. Later, as their confidence grew, they began selecting from devoted families within the congregation, framing selection as the highest honor a family could receive. To give a child to the Spirit was considered the ultimate expression of faith, Carver recalled. Parents would compete for this blessing, offering their sons and daughters with a fervor that seems unimaginable to me now. While the brothers maintained their distinct roles, Elder Ezra as the authoritative voice, Deacon Silas as the scholarly theologian, and Prophet Caleb as the mystical conduit to the divine, their private dynamic shifted over time. According to accounts from former Inner Circle members, Caleb's influence grew as his visions directed ever more aspects of church life. By 1840, it was Caleb who selected all candidates for elevation and determined the specific rituals to be used in each case. His mental state appears to have deteriorated significantly during this period. Journal entries attributed to him, recovered from a hidden compartment in his private quarters, reveal increasingly incoherent writings interspersed with detailed anatomical drawings. One entry from 1842 reads, "The Spirit has revealed that souls reside not merely in the heart or mind as commonly thought, but are distributed throughout the body in specific nodes. Each elevation allows me to map these sacred points more precisely. Soon I shall have the complete divine anatomy." As the church's membership grew to nearly 300 by 1845, the Ravencrofts faced the practical challenge of disposing of evidence from their increasing number of elevations. This led to one of their most macabre innovations, the selling of human remains to medical schools. In the mid-19th century, medical colleges struggled to obtain cadavers for anatomical study. Legal sources were limited primarily to executed criminals, leaving an insufficient supply for teaching purposes. This created a black market for bodies, with resurrection men illegally exhuming the recently buried or claiming unclaimed bodies from poorhouses. Deacon Silas, whose scholarly pursuits had given him connections in academic circles, established relationships with agents who supplied medical schools in Albany, New York City, and as far away as Philadelphia. Church records indicate that between 1840 and 1845, at least 67 vessels were donated to the advancement of medical science, a euphemism for the sale of murder victims' bodies. This commercial aspect served multiple purposes for the Ravencrofts. It disposed of evidence, generated significant income for the church, and provided Deacon Silas with access to medical knowledge that he incorporated into the cult's practices. From these transactions, he learned improved preservation techniques and more efficient methods of causing pain without leaving external marks, knowledge that would make the church's later atrocities even more sophisticated. By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had evolved from a fringe religious group into something unprecedented, a self-sustaining system of indoctrination, ritual murder, and profit disguised as spiritual advancement. The brothers had created what one federal investigator would later call a perfect machine for evil, operating in plain sight under the protection of religious freedom. Yet, despite their careful management of appearances, rumors began to spread. The sheer number of people who had joined the church only to disappear from public life raised questions. Former members who had fled rarely spoke openly about their experiences, fearing either disbelief or retaliation. but their haunted expressions and reluctance to discuss their time with the Ravencrofts fueled local suspicions. It was these growing murmurs, combined with an unexpected discovery by a postal inspector investigating financial irregularities, that would eventually draw official attention to the quiet horror unfolding in Ravenwood. But that reckoning still lay years in the future. For now, the Church of the Pure Spirit continued its dark work, its true nature hidden beneath layers of religious respectability and the fervent devotion of followers who had been taught to see murder as the highest form of worship. Before we continue with the story of the Church of the Pure Spirit, if you're enjoying this dark tale of religious horror in America's past, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Your support helps us bring more of these forgotten historical nightmares to light. Now, let's return to the twisted world of the Ravencroft brothers. The public face of the Church of the Pure Spirit reached its zenith during the late 1840s. To the outside world, the Ravencroft brothers appeared to be successful religious leaders riding the wave of the Second Great Awakening. Their compound had expanded to include not only the main church building and underground chambers, but also dormitories for single members, modest homes for families, workshops where church goods were produced, and even a small school for the children of followers. Visitors to Ravenwood often commented on the prosperity and orderliness of the church community. The Ravencrofts were particularly careful about who they allowed onto their property, generally limiting access to potential converts who had been carefully vetted or to respected community figures they wished to impress. During these sanctioned visits, what outsiders saw was an industrious religious community where members worked together, prayed together, and supported one another. What remained invisible was the web of psychological control, the nighttime rituals in the underground chambers, and the steadily increasing number of elevations. Also hidden was the growing wealth of the Ravencroft brothers, amassed through donations from followers, the sale of human remains to medical schools, and various businesses operated under church auspices but primarily benefiting the brothers. The first significant thread that would eventually unravel their carefully constructed facade appeared in 1847 when James Thornhill, a postal inspector investigating financial irregularities in several upstate New York communities, noticed unusual patterns in banking transactions connected to the Church of the Pure Spirit. Large sums deposited at irregular intervals, always in cash, Thornhill noted in his official report. Amounts consistent with institutional deposits rather than individual banking. Transfers to medical colleges in Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore with vague notations regarding research donations. Thornhill's investigation might have remained focused solely on potential financial improprieties had he not encountered Martha Simmons, a former church member who had fled the community after witnessing her sister's elevation in 1846. Initially reluctant to speak about her experiences, Simmons eventually provided Thornhill with the first official testimony about the true nature of the Ravencrofts' activities. She spoke of rituals involving torture, of bodies kept in underground chambers, of children being selected for special blessings and never seen again. Claims so outlandish that I would have dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind, Thornhill wrote, had they not aligned so perfectly with the financial irregularities I'd already documented. Thornhill brought his concerns to his superiors, but the response was tepid at best. Religious freedom was strongly protected, and accusations against a church required extraordinary evidence. Without permission to pursue an official investigation, Thornhill continued gathering information privately, creating a network of contacts around Ravenwood who could report on the church's activities. One such contact was Dr. William Garrett, a physician in Albany who had grown suspicious about the condition of cadavers he examined that allegedly came from the Church of the Pure Spirit. Standard practice was to receive bodies of the deceased who had donated their remains to medical science, Garrett later testified. But these specimens showed signs of systematic antemortem trauma, injury sustained before death that had partially healed, and the manner of death itself was consistent across multiple bodies, evidence of asphyxiation combined with extreme physical stress. In 1850, Garrett secretly reached out to Thornhill, providing detailed medical reports on 7 bodies he had examined. These documents provided the first scientific evidence that something sinister was occurring at the Church of the Pure Spirit. Still, authorities remained reluctant to act against a religious organization without irrefutable proof of criminal activity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1851, Prophet Caleb Ravencroft's mental state, which had been deteriorating for years, reached a crisis point according to accounts from church members who later testified. He began experiencing violent episodes where he would rave about spirits emerging from the walls and, the divine anatomy, becoming visible in the air. During church services, his prophetic utterances became increasingly bizarre and frightening, even to the most devoted followers. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas attempted to manage the situation by limiting Prophet Caleb's public appearances, explaining his absences as periods of intense communion with the Spirit. In private, however, they confined him to a specially constructed room in the furthest reaches of the underground chambers, where his screams would not be heard above ground. This confinement might have contained the immediate problem had Prophet Caleb not escaped during a momentary lapse in supervision. On the night of June 17, 1851, he somehow freed himself from his restraints and made his way through the catacombs to emerge in the woods beyond the church property. What followed was described in the Albany Evening Journal as a scene of public madness unprecedented in the region's history. Naked and covered in self-inflicted wounds, Prophet Caleb appeared in Ravenwood's town square during a community gathering celebrating the summer planting. Before a crowd of horrified onlookers, he proclaimed himself the living vessel of the all-pure Spirit, and began describing in explicit detail the rituals conducted beneath the church. "The blood of the purified strengthens our connection to the divine," he reportedly shouted. 217 vessels have been emptied, and the Spirit has filled me with their essence. The chambers beneath hold the sacred remains of the elevated, and soon all of you shall join them in glorious suffering. Local authorities detained Prophet Caleb, initially believing him to be simply a dangerous lunatic. When he identified himself as one of the Ravencroft brothers, however, his ravings took on new significance. Thornhill, who had cultivated relationships with several local officials, was notified immediately. He arrived in Ravenwood the following day to interview Prophet Caleb. What he found was a man in the final stages of complete psychological collapse. Prophet Caleb alternated between periods of catatonic silence and frenzied confession, during which he provided details about the church's activities that corroborated earlier testimonies from escaped members. Most significantly, he drew detailed maps of the underground chambers, including locations of hidden entrances and the Chamber of Saints where victims' remains were kept. Armed with this new evidence and Prophet Caleb's first-hand testimony, Thornhill finally secured authorization for an official investigation. However, word of Prophet Caleb's detention and subsequent questioning reached Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas before authorities could organize a proper search of the church grounds. What happened next demonstrated the brothers' ruthless efficiency in crisis management. Within hours of learning of Prophet Caleb's detention, they initiated what church records later revealed was a contingency plan called the Cleansing Flame. Members of the inner circle were dispatched to remove the most incriminating evidence from the underground chambers, particularly financial records and the most recently deceased bodies. Then, in a move that showed both desperation and calculated cunning, they orchestrated a controlled fire in the main church building. The fire was carefully set to destroy specific areas while leaving others intact, creating the appearance of a tragic accident rather than deliberate destruction of evidence. By the time authorities arrived with a search warrant on June 19, 1851, they found the church building partially burned and the congregation engaged in recovery efforts. Elder Ezra greeted officials with apparent cooperation, expressing shock at his brother's mental breakdown and offering full access to the property. "It seems God has tested us doubly," he reportedly told investigators. "First with the affliction of my beloved brother's mind, and now with this terrible fire. But we shall rebuild, as faith must always rise from ashes." The investigation that followed was hampered not only by the fire damage but by the brothers' meticulous preparation. The entrance to the main tunnel system had been collapsed in the fire, making access difficult. When excavation finally revealed the underground chambers, investigators found them partially flooded, a result of deliberately diverted water from a nearby stream. Many rooms had been emptied of their contents, with evidence of hasty removal. Nevertheless, enough remained to confirm the most disturbing aspects of Prophet Caleb's confession. In chambers that had escaped both fire and flooding, investigators discovered specialized restraints, tools modified for torture, and chemical compounds used in embalming. Most damning was the Chamber of Saints where, despite efforts to remove evidence, dozens of human remains were found in various states of preservation. "The scene defies adequate description," wrote federal investigator Daniel Blackwood in his official report. Skeletal remains arranged in poses of supplication, partially preserved corpses seated as though participating in some macabre congregation, and most disturbing, small chambers containing the remains of children positioned as though at play but bearing clear evidence of violent deaths. The discovery shocked even hardened investigators. Newspaper accounts, though heavily censored due to Victorian sensibilities, conveyed enough details to create widespread horror. The Albany Evening Journal's headline on June 25, 1851, read simply, "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House, Brothers Accused of Unspeakable Acts in Name of Religion." As authorities worked to identify the remains and determine the full extent of the Ravencroft's crimes, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas maintained their innocence. They claimed that Prophet Caleb had conducted his activities in secret without their knowledge or approval and expressed shock and dismay at the discoveries. Given their careful compartmentalization of church operations, this defense might have carried some weight had it not been for one final damning piece of evidence. In a hidden compartment beneath Deacon Silas's personal quarters, investigators discovered a leather-bound ledger documenting every elevation from 1829 to 1851. The book, written in Deacon Silas's distinctive handwriting, contained names, dates, descriptions of methods used, and notations regarding the disposition of remains, including those sold to medical institutions. Most incriminating were entries specifically attributing direction and participation to all three brothers, with special mention of Elder Ezra's role in selecting candidates for elevation. This ledger, combined with testimony from former members and Prophet Caleb's confession, provided overwhelming evidence of the brothers' guilt. On July 3, 1851, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft were arrested on multiple charges of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. The case against the Ravencroft brothers would become one of the most sensational trials of the mid-19th century. Though much of the most disturbing evidence was kept from public view by authorities concerned about its potential impact on public morality and religious sensibilities, the investigation continued to uncover new horrors, expanding well beyond the events at the church itself to include the brothers' earlier activities and the full network of their operations. But even as the legal process moved forward, the darkest secrets of the Church of the Pure Spirit remained hidden, awaiting discovery by those who would continue to investigate long after the Ravencrofts had faced justice. As the investigation into the Church of the Pure Spirit deepened through the summer of 1851, authorities found themselves confronting a criminal enterprise far more extensive than initially believed. The Ravencroft brothers had created not merely a cult with aberrant practices, but an intricate system that extended tendrils into multiple aspects of American society: religious, medical, and financial. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas remained in custody awaiting trial, while Prophet Caleb had been committed to the state lunatic asylum at Utica, deemed too mentally unstable to stand trial. Their followers, meanwhile, had scattered, some fleeing to avoid prosecution, others remaining in Ravenwood in a state of shock and disbelief, their entire worldview shattered by the revelations. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood, assigned to lead the case, established a temporary office in Ravenwood to coordinate the sprawling investigation. As he pieced together evidence from church records, witness testimonies, and forensic examinations, a disturbing timeline emerged that stretched back even before the brothers' arrival in upstate New York. The Ravencrofts did not begin their crimes in Ravenwood, Blackwood wrote in a confidential report to his superiors in Washington. Evidence suggests similar activities in at least 3 previous locations dating back to 1817. In each case, they established a religious community, gathered vulnerable followers, and departed before authorities became suspicious. What distinguishes Ravenwood is not the nature of their activities, but their duration and scale. Records recovered from a hidden vault beneath Deacon Silas's quarters revealed that the brothers had operated under different names in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio before settling in New York. In each location, they had refined their methods, learning from mistakes and developing the theological framework that would eventually become the doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting the brothers had not acted entirely alone. Correspondence between Deacon Silas and individuals at several medical colleges indicated knowledge, if not explicit awareness, of the illicit source of the specimens being provided. One letter from a prominent Philadelphia anatomist dated 1844 praised the exceptional quality and unique preparation of bodies received from the church, noting that the subjects show evidence of systematic anatomical study prior to death, as though the bodies were prepared for our work while still living. This revelation opened a new and horrifying dimension to the case. The Ravencrofts had not merely been killing their followers in the name of religious purification. They had been conducting systematic experiments on living subjects, documenting their findings, and selling both the bodies and their research to medical institutions. The brothers appear to have been conducting a form of primitive physiological research, Dr. Samuel Prescott of the Albany Medical College stated in his expert testimony to investigators. The patterns of injury, the methods of preserving tissue, and the detailed anatomical notes suggest an attempt to study human responses to various stimuli, particularly pain, and its effects on the body's systems. In August 1851, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a respected physician from Boston came forward with information that transformed understanding of the case. Dr. Jonathan Crane had been a student at Harvard Medical School in the late 1820s, where he had briefly encountered a visiting lecturer named Simon Ravingwood who presented controversial theories about pain responses and religious ecstasy. "I remember being disturbed by his methods and conclusions," Dr. Crane testified. He described experiments that seemed unethical, even by the standards of that time, and spoke of pain as a gateway to transcendent experience. I had dismissed him as a medical eccentric, but seeing the newspaper accounts of the Ravencroft case, I recognized not only the theories but the man himself from the published sketches. Simon Ravingwood and Silas Ravencroft are undoubtedly the same person. This connection suggested that the religious doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit had not been merely a means of controlling followers or justifying murder, but rather that the religious framework had been constructed specifically to facilitate systematic human experimentation. The brothers had created a belief system that not only permitted but sanctified the very acts that served their research. As investigators followed this new line of inquiry, they discovered a hidden room beneath Deacon Silas's quarters that contained hundreds of notebooks filled with detailed anatomical drawings, experimental protocols, and observations. The journals documented a grotesque research program spanning decades, with entries becoming increasingly scientific and less religious in their language as time progressed. Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of, redacted, read one particularly disturbing entry from 1848. Heart continued functioning for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials. Blood loss measured at approximately 1.7 liters. Results support hypothesis regarding sustainability of vital functions under extreme conditions. When this evidence was presented to Elder Ezra during interrogation, his facade of religious devotion finally cracked. According to transcripts of the interview, he laughed for nearly a minute before speaking. "You understand nothing," he reportedly told Blackwood. "The Spirit has many names. Some call it God, others science. We merely sought knowledge that others were too weak to pursue. The elevation of our followers was genuine. They contributed to understanding that will benefit mankind for generations. Their suffering had purpose. Their deaths had meaning." The discovery of the brothers' true motive sent shockwaves through the medical establishment. Several prominent physicians and medical schools that had received specimens or research from the Ravencrofts found themselves under scrutiny, forcing a broader conversation about ethical standards in medical research and education. Meanwhile, as autumn approached, investigators continued the grim work of excavating the church grounds. Initial estimates of victims had been based on Prophet Caleb's claim of 217 vessels, but as the dig progressed, it became clear that the actual number was significantly higher. "We have identified remains of at least 276 individuals thus far," Blackwood reported in September. "Based on soil analysis and structural expansion of the underground chambers, we believe additional remains may be found beneath the adjacent property." The brothers appear to have been tunneling outward as their operation expanded. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery of correspondence suggesting that not all of the victims had been willing members of the church. Letters between Elder Ezra and various associates in nearby towns indicated a system for identifying and acquiring suitable subjects, predominantly travelers, immigrants, and others who would not be immediately missed. "The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel," read one such letter from a church member in a neighboring community. "No family, seeking work, strong constitution. I have directed him to Ravenwood with promise of employment at the mill. Expect his arrival by Saturday next." This evidence transformed understanding of the case from one of religious extremism preying on willing followers to something closer to organized abduction and murder for both profit and pseudoscientific research. The implications were disturbing not only for the scale of the brothers' crimes, but for the suggestion of a wider network of complicity. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Ravenwood intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories.